Bon dia. And that's it. Now we go to English. How are you all? Yeah, lots of smiling, happy faces. Well, good. So let me simplify the business case for sustainability. Business is a wholly owned subsidiary of society, and society is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment. If the environment crashes, society will crash, business will crash. I don't have to say any more. Business needs to think about the environment and also think about society, because it makes good sense for their future, their sustainable future, their long-term future. So let me get into my presentation. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about culture and brand being two sides of the same coin. On one side, we have the employee perspective, and that's the culture. And on the other side, we've got the customer perspective, and what they see is the brand. Now, it's really important for both sides of that coin to be transparent. Who you are on the inside looks a lot like who you are on the outside. And so living the brand, living the culture is vitally important. Basically, if you want to build a sustainable brand, then you need to build, I would say, a values-driven culture. Let me tell you why. My whole speech today is about that. It's about how to build, measure, and manage a values-driven culture. Yesterday, we heard the CEO of Cultura saying, we want to measure. We need to measure. Well, what I'm going to show you today is how to measure the intangible of culture, because it is not intangible. It can be measured. In about 2 months' time, I'll be bringing out this book here in Brazil. You can see it's in Portuguese. That's so fantastic. It'll be out in a couple of months, but it's already out in English. It's called The Values-Driven Organization. And in that book, I explain how to build a values-driven organization, how to measure a culture, and how to map the values of leaders. So why are values-driven organizations the most sustainable, successful organizations on the planet? What do they focus on? What makes them successful? They care about the needs of their employees. And when you care about the needs of your employees, guess what? Your employees care about you. I mean, it's the golden rule. It makes such common sense. So here I mapped the portfolio value of the top 40 best companies to work for in the USA over a period of 10 years, and that's the red line. And you can see in 2008, it took a significant dip because of the global economic meltdown. But right there you see the average annual return of these best companies to work for is over 16% compared to the S&P 500, which is about 4%. So right there you've got an amazing financial advantage. Now let me point out one more thing here. If you look carefully here at the gap between before the economic meltdown, the value, and after, there's about a 1 year, just over 1 year gap there, 18 months. Whereas if you compare the same gap here for the S&P 500, it's almost 3 years. In other words, when you care about your employees, you have a more resilient company. You're able to bounce back from difficulties very quickly. These are, that was a mistake, that slide. I apologize for that. So what is the difference between the best companies to work for and other companies? Is, as I already said, the leaders care about the needs of their employees. They care about what their employees value. You see, whatever needs you have, whatever unmet needs you have, that is what you'll value. If you, for example, you've lost your job and you don't have any savings, well, what do you value? Money. You need money. Values and needs are practically the same thing. So let's have a look at what employees value. But before we do that, let me just remind you of what Tom Peters said many years ago. He said, clarifying the value system and breathing life into it are the greatest contributions a leader can make. Is the leader of your organization clarifying values? Because that is the real role of the leader. So what motivates employees? I'll just read from this. At any given moment in time, the values that are most important to us are the needs of the stage of psychological development we've reached and the unmet needs of the stages of psychological development we've passed through but haven't not yet mastered. So our needs, that is, what we value, have always been and always will be the principal drivers of our behaviors and actions. In other words, our needs drive our motivations. Now, everybody is not the same, and as you grow and evolve in consciousness or in terms of psychological development, your needs and values change. So, regarding employees, all employees to be the same, that is not true. At different ages, employees will have different needs, and so when you work through your incentives for your employees, you need to recognize that. So let's just take a look at this. Here are the stages of psychological development. So, you remember this stage? We were all at that stage one time. It was all about survival, basically, and staying alive. And instinctively, we knew how to suckle, we knew how to get the attention of our parents, and if we got their attention, they paid attention to our needs. And then as we got to the next stage of our development, whoa, I just noticed something different. There should be a different photograph for each stage. There we go. Sorry about that. This is the next stage of development. At this stage, we're now like 3 or 4 years old, and we begin to realize that in order to be safe, we need to conform to the parental needs and parental culture and the culture that we live in. And so we move into this second stage of development, which is conforming. And then we move to the next stage of development, which is differentiating. These are the teenagers in our lives and the people in our early 20s. And guess what? We need to look good. We need to excel at whatever it is that we're good at. And that is what we need. And so that is what we do. That is what we value. Then we move to the next stage. I'm sorry about this. I thought this was all organized. The next stage is the individuation stage, and generally we get to this stage in our late 20s and early 30s and throughout the decade of the 30s, and we begin to realize that we have our own values, that we're not exactly the same as our parents, we're not exactly the same as our culture, and we begin to find our own values and develop our own beliefs, and we begin to separate ourselves, especially if we've had a higher education, especially if we've been traveling in the world, around the world. We begin to be able to look at our culture instead of looking through it. And we individuate. And this leads us then to the next stage, which is the stage of self-actualization. At self-actualization, we begin to think about meaning. What brings our life meaning? Up to this stage, we've been concerned about being happy. But happiness and meaning are not exactly the same thing. I mean, when you want meaning in your life, you have to sometimes deal with difficult situations, and it's not always happy. But meaning becomes more important as we get to the self-actualization stage, and this is the stage when the soul begins to impact in your life, and whatever you're passionate about begins to come through. And you want to spend more and more time doing that. And the courage that you learned at the individuation stage is now really important because you need to go out into the world and go to the next stage of development, which is the integrating stage, which is about making a difference in the world. So at this stage, all you want to do is to take your meaning, take your passion, begin to collaborate with other people and make a difference in the world. And then finally, we move to the next stage. And I think this is where Richard Branson is right now. He's at the serving stage. This is where I feel I am right now. You know, I'm twice the average age of the average age of the British population, and for me, it's all about serving, because that's how I find my passion, being of service to others. Now, are these stages linked to decades? Yes, they are, but you can accelerate that, and there are some people who simply are old souls who are serving already, you know, in their 20s. We saw one or two examples of that yesterday. But generally speaking, most of the population goes through this, and these are what the employees are, and this is what they value at each of these levels of consciousness. Now, I'm now talking about, not about stages of development, levels of consciousness. So the survival level of consciousness, like as I said, if you have a job and you lose your job and you have to find money, then this is what you value. These are the things that are important to you. Survival, safety, control, financial stability. And at the second level, we call this relationship consciousness. It's about belonging. It's about friends. It's about respect. And at the third stage, it's about self-esteem. This is what we value at this stage. We value excellence, status, pride, and recognition. And we move to the next stage, and we begin to value adventure. We become more courageous. And we want to have more responsibility. And we want to learn and grow. And at the next stage, meaning becomes important. Purpose becomes important. Integrity, trust, commitment, creativity. And at the next stage, making a difference becomes important. And we begin to coach others and give back. We mentor people and we collaborate. And at this stage, we develop our sense of empathy. And finally, we move to the next level of consciousness, which is the level of serving, where it's really important for us to exercise compassion, humility, and all of the other words you see up here. So at each stage of development or each stage of consciousness, there are specific values that are important to us. And so we can actually, if we can measure those values, we can actually measure consciousness, and that's what I'm going to talk about. But basically, as we move up these stages of consciousness or development, in the first three stages, we're pretty much focused on ourselves. Then we transform and we become focused on the common good. Put it this way, in the early stages of our development, it's all about me, and in the higher stages of our development, it's all about the common good. So, I believe there are three mantras to organizational performance. The first is that cultural capital is the new frontier of competitive advantage. Who you are and what you stand for is vitally important. And you need to focus on your vision, mission, and values. The next mantra is, the culture of an organization is a reflection of the leadership consciousness. Organizations don't transform, people do. And so if you want to transform your organization, then you have to transform the way in which the leaders think. And yesterday we heard from some leaders who already transformed their consciousness. But that's what it takes. And it's a hard journey. Because it begins with self-leadership. Knowing yourself and understanding who you are and being able to manage your emotions. And then next, measurement matters. If you can measure something, you can manage it. And if you can measure consciousness, you can manage consciousness. You can make the evolution of consciousness conscious. Never before in the history of human evolution have we been able to make the evolution of consciousness conscious. That's an amazing statement. But if you can measure it, we can manage it. And that's the opportunity that we now have. And so, I've talked about personal development. Let's talk about organizations. They grow and develop in the same way. At the survival level, it's about making money. If you don't make money, how can you be profitable? And the next level of consciousness is about relationships. It's about employee respect, employee satisfaction. The next stage is about self-esteem. It's about pride and excellence in performance. The next stage is about continuous renewal and learning, in other words, transformation. And we move to the next stage of organizational consciousness. It's about building a strong corporate community, internal cohesion. Then we move to the next stage of consciousness, which is the making a difference. This is where we make strategic alliances with other companies to make a bigger difference in the world and also to help us with our own safety, or to, let me put it this way, to help us make us more resilient. And finally, we move to the service level of consciousness, where we're concerned about humanity and the planet and the impact that we're having as an organization. And so, how do we measure consciousness? Very simple. We ask 3 simple questions. Which of the following list of values represent who you are? You pick 10. Which of the following words represent how your organization operates? You pick 10. And then, which of the following words represent how you'd like your organization to operate? You pick 10. And each one of these values that you pick belongs to a level of consciousness, as we saw earlier. And so you can immediately see where the consciousness of the people in your organization is, where they think the culture is, and where they would like the culture to be. And where they think the culture is a reflection of the leader's consciousness, because the organizational consciousness is a reflection of the leader's consciousness. So if we want to build a sustainable world, it's all right. We have to do all of these things with technology and innovation, but it begins with the individual. It begins with the leaders and the managers of the organization. If their consciousness has not evolved to the point where they've moved from I to we, it doesn't make much difference. And so, when you pick 10 values that represent all employees participate, they pick 10 values about how the organization operates. We can pick the top 10 values, and this is what we've done here, 100 employees, and these are the values that they came up with. The number 1 value is tradition. Tradition can be a limiting value. That's what that little L means, because it can limit innovation. And it's a level 2. You see it as a level 2 relationship value. And the second value is diversity, and that's a level 4 value. It's a transformational value. And control is a limiting level 1 value. And so we can plot these positive values and these limiting values to the scale of the 7 levels, and we can see where the consciousness of the organization is. Now, we asked, in this example, 100 people to pick 10 values. Well, if we plot the... Next slide, please. If we plot all of the 100 votes, so that was the top 10. Now, if we plot all the 100 votes, we can see the distribution of the votes for values and the levels of consciousness on which they arrive at. And in red there, we can see the values which are called potentially limiting values. And in this particular case, only 11% of the values picked were limiting. And we call this percentage cultural entropy. This is the degree of dysfunction in the system. The degree of dysfunction, it's the extra effort that you have to make in order to get value out of the organization. When you've got high levels of bureaucracy or hierarchy, it is so much more difficult for you to do that. Now, I noticed some of you taking photographs of these slides. You don't have to do that, because these slides are already up on something called SlideShare, www.slideshare, at Barrett Values, and you can download the whole presentation. It's free. Just do that. So cultural entropy is a measure of the conflict and friction that there is in a group of people. So in 2008, in August, we mapped the values of the people of Iceland, and the cultural entropy in Iceland in August of 2008 was 56%. That was like hugely high. And if Iceland, and this is what I said when I went to Iceland, if Iceland was an organization, it would be going bankrupt about now because of that huge level of entropy. And 2 weeks later, Iceland went bankrupt because of that high entropy. So here's the relationship between entropy and employee engagement. Of course, when you've got high entropy, you have low engagement. When you've got low entropy, you have high engagement. And there's a very fixed line of relationship there. And so, where does cultural entropy come from? It actually comes from the personal entropy of the leaders. Do you ever worked with a leader who quickly gets angry, who really wants to do it his way or her way, is difficult to work with? That's personal entropy. And we can measure that with a different type of tool. And so that's where cultural entropy comes from. So if you want to transform your organization, you basically have to transform the managers and leaders of the organization. So what is personal entropy? It's the amount of fear-driven energy that the leaders hold on to. Now, I notice here it says 2 minutes 53, which means I think I've passed my limit, correct? So I will now quickly move to conclusion. So I'm going to give you a quick example. It won't take more than 3 or 4 minutes. This is an organization, and here in South Africa, we mapped the values of the personal values. You see those on the left. In the middle, we see the current culture, and in the right-hand side, we see the desired culture, and they're all positive values. And this is after 7 years of work. And this is a really great result, because there are many matching values between personal and current and desired. But it took us a long time to get there, because and the cultural entropy now is about 10%, but when we first started in 2005, the entropy, you see it at the bottom there, was around 25%. And each year they mapped the values of their organization, they looked at the results, they looked at the desired culture, they made some changes, and the next year it went down to 19, then 17, then 14, and then down again, down again, down again. And right now, cultural entropy in this organization is about 10%. And what's happened to all of the results? So this survey is not obligatory, but what's happened is more and more employees participate every year because they realize it's in their interest to do so, because the leaders listen to the results and make changes. How would that be if we did that with our governments? That would be an amazing change, wouldn't it, if our politicians listened to what we said? Anyhow, more people would vote. And this is what happened to cultural entropy. It went down. And this is what happened to total revenues. As entropy went down, revenues went up. As the productivity for employee went up, as entropy went down. And as entropy went down, the share price also went up, except for that economic meltdown right there. And so, here we see that when you measure consciousness and by mapping values, you can actually manage the culture of the organization. And you can move from high entropy to low entropy. You can move from non-sustainability to sustainability. And you can basically transform the organization. But, and this is the big but, the leaders have to transform before the organization can transform. Thank you for your attention. I'm sorry for running over.